and how they had to use wooden sticks to unconstipate the cows. Because if they didn't, cows actually... Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Eric Planey.
Hello, I'm Lucas Finko.
Hello, I'm Carolyn Kissane.
Well, welcome, Carolyn. The three of us today on October 20th are the Pirates of Clean Tech.
Walk the plank.
That was pretty good today. We were a little bit all different in our yars and args and
yeah, a little bit
good stuff. Well, welcome. This is, I believe, we're kind of lost count, but I believe it's episode 6 in our second season. It's amazing how fast time flies. We've been having a lot of fun. We have some great articles, and I'm going to turn it over to Lucas to introduce our special guest, and we can go from there.
All right. We are very privileged today to have the queen of New York energy, Carolyn Kissane, who everybody in energy, at least in New York, should know her. She headed up the energy forum. She teaches, she's an assistant dean, I believe, at NYU's Center for Global Affairs. She's everywhere. She knows everybody. She's super connected. Welcome, Carolyn Kissane. How are you?
I'm great, Lucas, and I have to laugh because you've promoted me. You've made me the founder of the Energy Forum, and I think the founders of the Energy Forum would be like, wait a second. She's a relatively new member, but I am on the board of the Energy Forum, and a great group, and I'm the academic director at the NYU Center for Global Affairs, and I run the Energy and Environmental Policy concentration. But I am a very proud member of the New York City energy community, and I'm thrilled to be here with both of you, and very excited to have been invited because I love what you're doing, and I love the fact that you look at sort of very topical issues and present them to your audience. So. Again, and it's not often that I start an event with a Pirates shout out. So,
well, that's why we're allowed to elevate your positions and your stature anyway. We're Pirates. We don't pay attention.
Whatever you want, right? It's all good. It's all good.
So we feel better knowing that the Pirates have a queen on board. So I think it's absolutely perfect and appropriate.
Well, I have been with my kids before, and some people will be like, "Oh my gosh, it's brave." It's
Okay, so now that I've royally screwed that up, I'm gonna keep screwing it up. So tell us about NYU. You teach a class on global geopolitics with regards to energy, and you're part of this Clean Start program. Well, what's going on over there?
Wow, we're doing a lot. So this semester, I'm teaching energy, environment, resource security. And in January, I'll be doing an intensive course on climate change and the way forward. And then I usually always teach the geopolitics of energy, which is kind of a core course that I teach. And I usually run a global field intensive to a country or a set of countries. Last year, I took students to Denmark and Norway, and we were looking at clean energy policies, sustainability, and climate change. This year, unfortunately, because of COVID, doesn't look like we'll be running a global field intensive, but sort of already thinking forward to 2022 and where we might go. And the students are really interested in the things that you both talk about, and really interested in clean energy, really interested in the energy transition, what it's looking like, right? Because we're experiencing it. And of course, issues around climate change, those are really the drivers in terms of their interest. And then Lucas, a big shout out to you because you teach in our Clean Energy Certificate Program, which is a tremendous success. And it came out of a conversation with Micah Koch, who at the time was at the Urban Future Lab, with Emily Wheeler, right? And it's now morphed into a really, really successful certificate. And we're really fortunate to have Lucas teaching in it. And so, we try to do as much as we can on the energy and environment front, both in the classroom through our graduate and our non-degree programs, and then out of the classroom through public events and, opportunities that we bring to students.
Wow, please, Carolyn, don't do anything to boost Lucas's ego any more than it already is at.
Nonsense.
It's going to get really difficult to be working with this guy going forward. If people
Eric, I have to say, Lucas's evaluations are great. Students really, really like him. So, I can only speak the truth.
I know one student that gave him a very bad valuation 5 years ago. I still have it.
That's not true. It's blasphemy. Okay, so you have a book coming out soon. Is this true? What's the story there?
I have a proposal for a book that that it's on its way to becoming more of a full-fledged book. Yes. But I wouldn't say it's coming out soon. But if we want to be very optimistic and exaggerate what might be in fact the truth, then yes, it's coming out really.
So it's probably about some geopolitics, right? And some energy and oil and.
Yeah, so right. The title as it is now is called Oil and Sex, and it's about the resource curse in some different parts of the world, one being Central Asia, where I had the chance to spend a number of years studying and also working. And it also has a kind of a personal narrative thread, which is kind of, I'm not going to give it away, right? So you're going to have to read the book when it eventually comes out, and then you'll know what that thread is.
Yeah, right. I just this summer I really have been trying to re-stimulate my mind in the wake of everything happening in the world, and I pulled off the shelf the book that really got me interested in international finance, which was this book from the early 90s called Investment Biker, where Jim Rogers of Columbia went around the world with his girlfriend on 2 BMW motorcycles. And, it's amazing in 1990, some of the parallels to today, but they really hit on Central Asia and, the pros and cons of that whole region, and tying it to like the kind of resource dependency is something that was brought up many, many times. And they just don't seem to have a way to get over that, it appears.
Yeah, and unfortunately, they're not alone, right? So, when we start talking about like peak oil, right, and peak demand, then, countries that have not diversified, it's not tomorrow, although they are suffering from the low oil prices, right, that, have set in since March. But the future doesn't look really bright without much deeper diversification.
Well, and there's even some conflict in the area now too, right? Which some people think is energy related.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In the Nagorno-Karabakh area between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and then you've got with Azerbaijan, you've got sort of Turkey on Azerbaijan's side, and then with Armenia, you have Russia on its side, and you've got a long-standing conflict and contention between Armenia and Turkey, and you've got the Baku-Tbilisi-Kayan pipeline, right, that runs through Azerbaijan, goes into Turkey. There's a lot, yeah. So there's definitely, I think, a very interesting energy part of the story that interestingly enough is really not being highlighted.
Yeah, none. Yeah, which I find odd.
So I know like the world of geopolitics is, kind of boring right now, not too much going on, very quiet these days. But in all seriousness, obviously, November 3rd is not just a big day for the United States, but for the rest of the world. And what happens on the US election will impact the rest of the world. How much of a pause is taking place now? We have a pause, obviously, from the COVID economy shutting down so much of the world, and, energy is certainly impacted by that. But how much is the rest of the world really waiting to see what will happen from the elections, and what kind of impact will that possibly have on next steps for energy usage, energy generation, globally? Is there any kind of one or two trends that you're going to see if Biden wins or if Trump wins?
Yeah, Eric, that's a great question. And it's a question that's on a lot of people's minds right now. And there's been a lot of analysis of, what a Biden win would mean for the US energy sector, what a Trump win would mean for the U.S. energy sector. You know, and I think a lot of people are holding their breath, right? You know, hoping that on November 3rd, the evening of November 3rd, we actually have a conclusive answer, and then fear that it may in fact be a contested election and what that could mean. But I think that there's a general sense, just in terms of the United States, that the United States will continue to produce oil and natural gas, whether it's Biden or Trump. But if it's Biden, I think it's very clear based on, you know, everything that he said and his commitments, that there will be a lot more attention to investments in renewable energy and infrastructure, and to, you know, rejoining the Paris Agreement. So a lot more optimistic in terms of re-engagement, global re-engagement, not just on energy, but just on all foreign policy fronts.
Yeah.
But again, you know, we're all, right, we're all kind of holding our breath right now.
Right.
But that said, you know, I think, and the prices, if we're just looking at fossil fuels, specifically oil and gas, especially oil, we're not seeing a lot of movement. So we're kind of stuck in the 40s, which we don't have to try very hard to go back just, you know, a year and a half ago when we're looking at $80, $90 a barrel oil. So the $40 is very painful, not just for US producers, but for global producers, which is having its own set of repercussions, especially for fragile petrol states.
Interesting.
It's precarious right now. And I thought the US did a very good job during the oil price crash of a couple years ago of resetting its cost structure. But I don't think it was meant to be sustained at these numbers, at this price. And so as a result, people are still hurting in kind of global gas and oil production, it appears.
Yeah, I know, and most analysts don't believe, like the EIA doesn't believe that the United States will get back to the 13 million barrels it was producing pre-COVID, right? That we're probably, if we ever get back to those numbers. And one of the things that's interesting, if you're just following the investment space, there's a lot of new partnerships, mergers that are happening that is really, really interesting. And I think, you know, kind of sort of telling for the market and what that means for the price collapse and some of the challenges that companies have with regards to budgetary shortfalls and the number of bankruptcies that have happened, especially within the sort of small to medium-sized firms that are now being, you know, in effect gobbled up by the larger companies.
Yeah, well said, Carolyn.
So, Carolyn, do you have some events coming up you'd like to plug? One or two?
So speaking, Eric asked about, we're going to be doing a Women in Energy. So I'm part of NYU as part of the consortium that's out of Columbia University, the Women in Energy program. So we're going to be looking at the election, and it's going to be on November 12th. Time to be determined, but I think we're scheduling it for about 11 o'clock. And we'll have like a absolute fantastic lineup of women who will be sort of speaking about the impact of the election. And again, since we don't know what the results of the election will be, but you know, women who could really sort of speak to the energy space writ large. So that's coming up on November 12th. And what else is coming up? And then on November 24th, I'm moderating a panel with Bob McNally, who's the author of Crude Volatility. And for those of you that are really interested in sort of oil price and the importance of having kind of the supply side of things in terms of having you know, kind of a stability in the market. It's a fantastic read. So Bob McNally, who's president of Rapidan Group, and Halima Croft, who's with RBC, who's their chief geopolitical strategist. I'll be in conversation with them on the 24th as part of our New York Energy Forum event on OPEC, which will be interesting because it'll probably be 2 weeks before the OPEC meeting in December, where all eyes will be on whether or not they continue the production cuts and what that's going to mean to price. Because if we want to we started the conversation with, you know, the pirate shout out. So, Saudi Arabia, right? Saudi Arabia, and the energy minister of Saudi Arabia basically told oil traders, like, you go short and you're going to get a kick in the ass. Like, basically is what he told people. So it's pretty serious in terms of what Saudi Arabia is going to do.
Well, I'm hearing about OPEC Plus having some cracks too. Is this true, Carolyn?
Yeah, it's been a cracked. I think it's been cracked since March, right? We had the volume war between Saudi Arabia and Russia, where the expectation was that Russia would kind of bow to Saudi and OPEC and cut production, and Russia said, sorry, we're not going to cut production. And Saudi turned around and basically, said, okay, you're not going to cut production. We're going to increase production. We're going to completely drop our price for Saudi crude, which was then able to be bought by a lot of Asian buyers. And that kind of held for about 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. And then, there was whichever theory you want to believe, whether it was, Trump stepping in and calling Saudi and reaching out to Putin and saying, listen, we need to have some stability in the market. And then we saw a $9.7 million production cut coming out of OPEC Plus, but it's not a perfect group. It's a very and they don't have similar, what they each want is very different. And I think that that's also important. I mean, they all want higher prices, but how they get to higher prices is important to recognize.
Yeah, it's a big Nash equilibrium game theory problem. Like, no, you reduce. No, you reduce, And, I've said in the past that I think OPEC is probably the worst cartel I could imagine. Like, they seem to be terrible at doing what they're trying to do. No?
Well,
but Bob would say that they started out, they were actually for a while in the 80s and 90s a very good cartel.
They were very good. Right.
And
now they're not.
And Saudi as a swing producer has been important. Sorry, Eric, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I was going to say very similar. Like it more is being produced outside of OPEC nations and inside of OPEC nations. So by very definition, the cartel is less effective because it has less control.
That's a good point.
All right, so I have to ask this question because I know we're going to get 1 or 2 people sending us emails, bringing this up. So I want to put it out there. They're going to say, you guys are talking about oil and gas and you're supposed to be the pirates of clean tech. We know this. Lucas and I are on page about this. And Carolyn, I think you're on page. Tell us why it's important for those who really want to focus on clean tech, why it's important to know what's happening in the oil and gas world.
Well, historically, right? And it's not just historically, it's even today, right? Oil and gas, fossil fuels still take up a very large part of our energy consumption, right? Globally, we're still looking at about 80% of overall energy use is fossil based. So I think it's just important to have that out there and understanding it. But that said, I think I think this has become a little bit more apparent, or definitely has kind of moved into technicolor, is that oil and gas producers they're aware, they are hyper aware of the energy transition, and they know that they have to get on board, right? They have to get on board in different ways. So if you look at, for example, anyone in your audience who follows BP, BP is no longer an international oil company, but it's an integrated energy company, which is pretty significant because they, and all of Total, ENI, BP, a lot of European traditional oil and gas companies now have net zero targets for 2050, and they are big investors in renewable energy. You have Equinor that has is a big player in the offshore wind. You have Shell, which is, I think becoming more of a power company, right? They're really interested in what's happening in power markets and how their place in that. So I think it's and all you see when you look at Saudi Arabia, I was this is probably going back now 3 years ago, and I was on a panel, and someone who's a Saudi expert said, if you, and he was privy to being in conversations with very high level Saudi elite. He said one thing that Saudi really, they're really concerned about climate change policies and how those policies may affect the revenues that come into Saudi Arabia. So this matters, right? So the conversations that you're having here, they're being heard by people in the oil and gas space, because they know that this is now. This is not just this is part of what they are sort of thinking about. And even if you look at ESG investors and that whole space, there's a lot of concern about what carbon emissions look like and so many other things.
Yeah, I think you hit it perfectly. And I'm paraphrasing Lucas here. So, but we talked about the fact when the oil and gas industry moves into clean tech, they're going to be doing so with so much force and capital resources, they will move the needle, right?
Yeah. And I would love to see like BP merge with National Grid or something like that, because they're kind of getting on the ball, and it's good to see. And we can't forget too that BP tried this once already about 15 years ago, and it didn't go so well. And people that know about T-Boone Pickens and wind in Texas didn't go so well. So they've been around the block. They haven't been sitting on the sidelines. They've been involved. They've learned some lessons, and so we shouldn't just discount them. Like she said, they still supply most of the energy for, say, the U.S. comes from the oil and gas industry. So we can't just drop them. We can't act like they're not there. We can't ignore them. So yeah.
And also, Lucas, to that point, right? I think there's a real awareness where I think when you're sort of talking to people in the fossil fuel space, right, that or that their income is predominantly generated from the production and sale of oil, gas, the like, that they know that like the idea of business as usual is no longer acceptable, that they have to be working really hard to reduce their own sort of emissions from how they produce. We're already seeing, I think we've gone through a whole rebranding of a lot of companies. Danish Oil and Natural Gas is now Ørsted, and they've completely sold off most of their oil, natural gas assets. Statoil is now Equinor. There's just a lot of rebranding and code switching, I think, that's happening. Well, at the same time, they're not, most of the big ones are not completely moving away from their main source of income, but they are branching out, and they're branching out oftentimes with a pretty not insignificant wallet in terms of money that they can put towards projects, which I believe and I hope that will do more, that provide more advantage to the clean tech, clean energy space, right? And that it's not hijacking the space, but it's actually contributing to the advancement of the space.
Yeah, well said. Completely agree with it. I think we're going to see more of that integration. I think BP would have been so much more advanced, but they had to sell assets during Mercondo.
Yeah. And
that's the reality of it. And so now they're getting back into the game. And remember, their tagline, marketing-wise, was Beyond Petroleum.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, listen, I think we could keep talking on and on, but I guess we do have some articles that we have to go through.
Very good articles, by the way. Those were super interesting for me to see and look at. I appreciate it, just having the chance to kind of dabble in some readings that I might not be my on my radar all the time.
Well, Carolyn, we may put you in charge of marketing then, because that's exactly what we're trying to do. As we like to say, we're just having a couple beers and getting together. I have my Angry Orchard from Hudson Valley.
Oh,
I have a glass of white wine because you said that I should come with something in hand, and I very much took the directive to heart. So I appreciated it.
It wasn't peer pressure, but I'm glad you accepted it.
Yeah, no, with pleasure, with pleasure.
I'm
This
drinking I'm drinking an Oktoberfest from Fort Nonsense Brewing Company in Morristown, New Jersey. There's a old fort called Fort Nonsense. I didn't name it. Don't ask.
It's a great name, though. Mm-hmm.
I'd say let's go there next week, but Cuomo's going to shut the border between New York and New Jersey. So
no, I'll be there.
And Connecticut, like it's just
No.
Actually, it's not going to be like because he recognizes the interconnectedness, but unless you're essential, you shouldn't be traveling between.
You can't do that. It's not Wisconsin. I mean, geez.
Done.
Come on, people.
It's Cuomo. He's going to do it. Come on. We're going to have a tri-state civil war.
Come on. Murphy gave up on broad lockdowns. He said they're going to do targeted, attacks on
New Jersey. The whole thing's going to be a targeted lockdown,
which I like. Okay, Aaron, you're up. Eric, you're up. Sorry.
All right. So this one's a little bit dated, September 23rd, but it's from Barron's, and I just saw it. I just came across it last week. Green hydrogen could be a $12 trillion market. Here's how to play it. So we haven't talked too much on the investment side of things lately, but this is referencing a Goldman Sachs article. We've talked about green hydrogen ad nauseum and hydrogen in general, about how the US really wasn't focusing on it. Asia and Europe have been, and now all of a sudden there's a lot of play, a lot of publicity, a lot of marketing. A couple of stats here I thought they were pretty interesting. The EU is so bullish on green hydrogen. They're talking about 40 gigawatts by 2030, and they're talking about 500 gigawatts of capacity by 2050. I mean, that is massive. But we've known this. We've seen that Europe is focusing on it. What Goldman is saying is that by 2050, it's going to be an even dollar split between Asia, the United States, North America, and Europe. So they're kind of saying, like, this article is focused on where should you invest. It was a little bit vague, quite honestly. They talk about some of the utilities that would be generating the green power that would actually go into the electrolysis process. They talked about some infrastructure generators. They talked about gas producers. They brought up some green infrastructure companies like NextEra, who is always two steps ahead of their competition. So I like this article just for the fact that it's just recognizing the fact that hydrogen could be 12 trillion in CapEx spending. That is beyond significant. I'm becoming more of a fan of green hydrogen as we go down this process of evaluating it a little further. I see its application and applicability. So I like this article. It's a little bit of a big smack across the heads up that green hydrogen's coming, and the US should be looking further and faster to catch up with our European and Asian colleagues. So Carolyn, what do you think? I know you talked a little bit about hydrogen today, I heard.
Yeah, I know, Eric, you hit it on so many fronts, right? Like, I think when I saw the title, it was that kind of like, whoa, right in your face, right? 12 trillion sort of stands out. And if everyone, like, if you just sort of stop and step back, like, how many times have we heard hydrogen just in the last 6 months, right? And I think if we go back even a year ago, hydrogen just didn't seem to have the cachet that it has right now. Like, hydrogen has really taken off, and I think a lot of that is because there's a lot more emphasis on climate change and sort of the energy transition. I had students in Japan in 2015. Everyone we talked to, from the government to people in the private sector, was talking about hydrogen. Everything was hydrogen, and Japan was going to be Japan's economy was the future hydrogen economy. And if we had the Tokyo Olympics, their plan was to really put the hydrogen economy forward in their whole in their marketing and their branding. So, like, everywhere I'm hearing it. So today I was attending the North American National Gas Conference, and this was not not green hydrogen, not e-hydrogen, but blue hydrogen, right, from natural gas, is really considered to be, something that we're going to be seeing a lot more of in the future. And I think maybe that might be why the United States is not putting as much emphasis on green hydrogen, which Europe is. And I think the article does a nice job of also going into that, like why Europe might be branding itself as more of a, preferring green hydrogen, but in fact may use more blue hydrogen from natural gas. And given the fact that the United States is such a prolific natural gas producer, it makes sense that it might take some of that natural gas and use it to produce hydrogen. But I think it's fair to say that there is no doubt that hydrogen is going to be a big part of our future, and that ultimately it could be displacing the way that we have over the last 10 years been talking about gas, right, as kind of that sort of transition fuel, that this is actually something that is much cleaner, that is more, might have more social acceptance. It's not sort of seen as like a fossil fuel. So, and I'm sure that that's part of the reasoning behind why it's been really taken up by Europe, because Europe is really putting probably the strongest foot forward with regards to how they address climate change and how they sort of tell the story of what they're doing with regards to their own energy transition.
Yeah, well said. Lucas, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't want to go on too much because you guys covered a lot of it already, but $10 trillion is a lot of money to spread around. 11.7 trillion is 10 trillion euro by 2050. So I just looked, ExxonMobil's market cap is 140 billion. So this is a huge opportunity for companies that are looking to get into the future of energy. So really cool to see this.
Yeah. And, and I, again, Lucas, as you said, the 12 trillion, I think that's what caught it. But yet, I also read something recently, we're all reading about sort of COVID numbers and the cost of, but in terms of, we just look at stimulus and various other costs associated with COVID, that we've already globally have spent over 12 trillion, right? So, if we think about, climate change and the crisis that it is, and that, how are we going to put our money forward and how are we going to invest, that it seems like a lot of countries are excited by hydrogen, and there seems to be a lot more attention and excitement just in the energy space to talk about hydrogen.
Yeah.
Going back to your point, Carolyn, about Japan, I've said it in prior episodes. 5 years ago, while the rest of America, US and European companies stopped talking about hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, Japan still did, and so did Korea. And you wonder, why were they still focusing on hydrogen fuel cell vehicles? But it goes back to, it's all about hydrogen economy in those countries. So to your point, well said and well played. So good article, totally recommend it. So next up, yes, Clean Technia. Now this is an article, I have to admit, I cheated a little bit. I saw the headline, I read the first paragraph, I sent it to the gang to read, and then I read it this morning and I'm like, oh, I don't know if I like this article.
It's not bad.
Well, we'll talk about it. But Daryl Elliott, October 18th, from Clean Technia, getting a country from moderate high EV purchase rate to 100% EV market share, some ideas. And it fascinated me because I knew that Norway, which Carolyn just talked about, was on the road to really being a prolific EV manufacturer, EV consumer. There's some statistics I saw where, Tesla is one of the biggest markets outside the United States is in Norway, which is fascinating for me because we've talked in the past about cold weather climates and battery degradation. So the fact that they're embracing EVs really shows how much trust there is in the technology. This article is kind of a hypothetical exercise for Daryl. How do you get a country like Norway from 82% to 100% utilization? And then how do you extrapolate that methodology and effectiveness and get the rest of the world to go from 20% to 100% or 5%? And a couple of his first bullet points are ones that I would absolutely agree with. Creating that incentive structure I like what he talked about here, which is the gas car laugh, which I've heard from a few people who have driven electric vehicles, with some regularity. Then they go back to a gasoline car and they're like, what is this? What is this antique that I'm driving? I don't necessarily feel that way. I have a Chevy Spark in my garage. I love it.
Yeah.
I go back to my V8 Pontiac and I love that just as much.
Yeah.
I can tell there's maybe a little, the two of you see things the same and see things differently on this front, on this particular.
Yeah. But what I didn't like here is what we had just talked about with Carolyn's fantastic introduction, which is making an enemy out of the oil and gas industry and making them kind of negatively incentivized to be an unwilling participant in the clean car revolution by putting them in the penalty box for what he believes are past sins. And to what we just talked about 5 minutes ago, I completely disagree with that. We talked about the fact that their capital firepower from the oil and gas industry is so great that if we bring them along on a positive aspect for the energy transition, which they recognize, and not put them in a penalty box, you're putting more resources heading in the same direction. And that's what I didn't like about the story. We don't need to, we don't need to have a split like we do so many ways in this country right now on, if you're not 100% with me, you must be 100% against me. And that's what this article was trying to do. It was a little bit of a shock jock type of article, not necessarily something I love. I'd rather find ways in which we find commonality and then bring people forward. So that's why I didn't like this story. I still love my V8 engine cars, no doubt about it, but I want to move to EV from a society basis. And I don't think this story helps in that regard.
Yeah, and I've said this before on the show. I'm not a huge fan of 100% clean energy, just because I think it's so hard to get there. And in a parallel, I'm not a huge fan of 100% electric vehicles, just because it's so difficult to get there. And then you end up in these heavy-handed, kind of almost crazy ideas to get 100% EVs when it's just not necessary. And, we don't need to ban the sale of internal combustion. We don't need to ban the sale of hybrids. I mean, we're using hybrids to help us transition to EVs. But we're already talking about banning them. Like, this is just, it's a little too far. We don't need to go here. We're just making enemies we don't need. So yeah, I agree with you, Eric.
So I have a couple of thoughts on this because I thought it was a really provocative piece. And as I mentioned earlier, so Eric, when I read it, I was like, oh my gosh, she must have known I went to Norway. But, one of the issues that we looked at when I had students in Norway was their EV adoption rates, right? Which are so high. It is a very small country, right? It's 4.5 million people. So it's a little bit easier and it's a very wealthy country overall. So it's a little bit easier for Norway to move the needle than it would be for most other countries, and they've really incentivized. So there's been a lot of, positives that people who buy EVs get, right? Even if you avoid a congestion price coming into Oslo, right? If you have an EV, you get access to better parking. There's a lot of things that having an EV in Norway gives you. That said, I think, where the article really fell short was the equity side, right? So, I think that it would be, and I agree with Lucas, like getting to 100% EVs is going to be hard because most people keep their vehicles for 10 years or longer. So if you buy a, internal combustion engine vehicle, you bought it last year, there's a very good chance you'll still have that vehicle on the road in 2030. And that also holds true I would say that holds true for the majority of places around the world. Sometimes it's much longer that you would actually be using your car. I think where you can see this having, like China. So if you look globally, 40% of EVs are sold in China. And they also have some very, aggressive EV policies so that it's much easier to get a car on the road if you buy an EV, whereas if you buy an ICE vehicle, you're either part of a lottery or an auction, and you can buy an EV and put it on the road tomorrow, right? And I think China's also pushing its own EV car market, automobile market, to be in competition with the ICE vehicle market. So there's a lot of like Chinese automakers. And going back to the laugh part, which kind of struck me, because last year my sister called me. She was in a Tesla test drive with her husband, and he was laughing in the background. He was like, I'll never get into a car, like a regular car again. This is like so extraordinary. This is amazing. Meanwhile, they had a great weekend with their Tesla. They had a blast. They were calling everyone and letting everyone know that they were in a Tesla, but they eventually went back to the car that they had in their driveway. Right.
Yeah.
That said, like I think that if just you look at the automobile market, there seems to be, at least in terms of the big players, they're all moving towards EVs or something which is a kind of hybrid EV based. So, will EVs ultimately have the last laugh? Right? Because there may not be a lot of choices going forward if the car makers continue to really put most of their research and development towards EVs.
Right. Yep. No, I think this story, it was good for the fact it was written, and it got us to have this conversation. We have a long way to go, and we have to appreciate all sides of the equation in order to get to the common goal. So anyways, so that's now for my most interesting story of the weekend. I'm going to dedicate this to my father. And the reason is I still remember as a child hearing the story about my dad and Uncle John growing up on a farm in Czechoslovakia during the war, and how they had to use wooden sticks to unconstipate the cows. Because if they didn't, cows actually, like, they don't explode, but all the buildup of gas will actually cause their stomachs to rupture, and they will fall over and die.
This is a family show, Eric. I mean, come on.
I know. Imagine being a 6-year-old hearing this story. And my dad reminded me, imagine being a 12-year-old having to perform the surgery.
To Eric's credit, I come from a dairy family. So not here in the United States, but in Ireland. All of my cousins are dairy farmers. So when I saw the article, I was like, oh my gosh, wow. So many connections here.
See, if it was in Norway, it would even be crazier. But this is out of Bloomberg this one is Bloomberg Green from August 31st. There was a follow-up story talking about a specific transaction, but the gas industry survival plan, making fuel from cow poop. And fossil fuel companies think renewable natural gas is the answer to the PR problems, but environmentalists don't think so. Well, I only skimmed through this article, but this also caught my eye because there was another story about Chevron forming a joint venture with a renewable gas venture to build like several of these plants, Michigan, New York State, all the way down to Florida, maybe Tennessee. And they're talking about putting cow manure into a renewable natural gas facility. And is this the wrong way to go? Is this the wrong way to think? I mean, we're talking about the fact that dairy cows are not going away anytime soon. So to take a resource that's generated from them, cow manure, and putting it towards, gas production, I don't think it's crazy to think about. But what both these stories got me thinking was, are we not being coordinated whatsoever, as we talked about earlier before we went on air? Are we not being coordinated enough in terms of talking about what type of fuel generation for your capital dollar expenditure is going to get us to where we need to go, which in my opinion is saving the 2 degrees centigrade by 2050. Are we spending a lot of money on these types of facilities, which, yeah, they do have some applicability and they are considered green, but are we really allocating resources effectively? And, that's my main takeaway from this story. We can go into a little more detail further, but I'd be curious to get your perspectives because, yeah, this is something we could be doing, but, should we be?
I guess, I don't know, Lucas. So my take on this was that, it's an interesting marketing story for Chevron, right? It's a very, it's to basically say that, we're going to be able to sort of take the manure, right, from cows and make it into renewable gas, right? There's kind of an interesting story there, right? It's a little bit off the norm. How big is it going to be? I would say it's probably going to be very, very small. It's not going to be a big part of Chevron's, sort of capital expenditures. It's probably going to be a very, niche part of their marketing, or maybe it's a big part of their marketing, right? Because it's a great story that, you're taking manure from cows, right? And you're using it for a renewable energy source. Like that's there, there's some good, if you're in the PR space, you can have a lot of fun with that. But I agree with you. Like, I don't think it's large enough to make that much of a difference. I think this idea though, of how do you reframe methane, because many of the oil and gas companies are really having a hard time with the methane story in their businesses, right? Methane emissions from gas, methane emissions, from oil production, and what they are going to do with that methane. So here's like, okay, well, let's make biomethane, right? This is biomethane from cows. So again, I think there's something compelling about it, but I agree that I don't see it as being kind of a game changer in any way, or is it going to, dramatically change the landscape, other than it's going to be yet another rather interesting idea that will gain some traction, but will be very limited. And again, like, right, there's a good story there. They're going into like farm towns, right? Towns where you're going to say, listen, especially, and maybe an interesting side, and I don't know, is that cows are getting a pretty bad rap, right? Cows are not like the favored animal when we're talking about climate change.
Yeah, it's true. Good point.
Around meat consumption. So here's a little bit of saying, hey, cows can be actually part of the energy transition and part of what we need to do around renewable, renewable natural gas, right? That's from taking the methane from cows, right? And using it to power a home, right? That's a pretty good story, right? That's not saying like eating a cow is really terrible and you're contributing to climate change.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
From my point of view, as I've said many, many times, I'm going to say it again, it's incredibly hard to get to kind of 100% renewable with solar and wind and storage. And just having like 10 or 20% natural gas dispatchable generation just makes things so much easier, affordable, and doable. And so if we can make that natural gas renewable, that's a huge win. So I'm all about RNG. I don't think my criticism is, 4% is not enough. I'd rather see 10% or 20%. I don't want to see companies saying, oh, if I save 4%, that'll offset emissions from my entire gas system. I don't get where that's coming from. But yeah, I want to see more of this. I think we need to keep those gas pipelines either for hydrogen or for RNG. We need to keep some natural gas generation to make our system reliable. So yes, I'm pro RNG. As long as it's not coming out of the ground, I'm pro. So good to see.
But let me add one quick last point. What I worry about is if it costs $1 billion to get to that 4% number, in order to get to 20%, if it costs 15 times multiple of that, are we being smart about it? Right? And that's what I worry about with these types of marketing plays.
Well, that's still less than the 12 trillion for hydrogen.
Maybe we pump the cows with hydrogen. They go float around. We figure it out.
But the 12 trillion is for investors, right? The 12 trillion is like the profits, right? That are potentially, or like it's both in terms of the whole market, right? That is a huge global market. Whereas I see renewable gas in this regard as being kind of a small story globally.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. And we talked about that too. Like, can you take the natural gas pipelines and convert them to hydrogen pipelines? Can you put hydrogen in a turbine? I saw one of these articles has another clickbait story we can click on, where a company is testing natural gas turbines and putting hydrogen in it, see how it goes. So that's a good story for me too.
Yeah, the green hydrogen story brings that up as well.
Yeah.
So, okay, I'm done.
Okay.
Lucas?
All right. My four stories are all very short, and they're all, well, one of them's kind of long, but they're all about storage. I saw a trend about storage, so I was like, let's talk about storage this week. The first one here is a little bit about pumped hydro, which I'm a huge fan of. Something like 95% of the current storage in the grid is pumped hydro. I don't know, a lot of the general public don't seem to understand that there is almost zero storage of electricity on the electricity grid currently, although that changes every year, and there's a lot of storage going in right now, but pumped hydro is the one that's already there. And this article from Utility Dive, to batteries and beyond in a high renewables world, pumped hydro storage could be the heavy artillery. This is kind of a position I've held for a long time. I've even written an article on energy storage, and I put pumped hydro as the headline image, just like on this article. I didn't put batteries because hydro just has huge quantities of potential energy storage, both, and I mean that as a pun, both potential as in a potential for ways to store energy, and potential energy as in kinetic versus whatever. We can put a laugh track in. So yeah, 95% of current energy storage is pumped hydro. So they talk a lot about how difficult it is to site, how difficult it is to build a reservoir to hold the water. This one company has put together 2 proposals in the 1 to 2 gigawatt range. So they're massive. We definitely need these adjacent to renewables. They will give you both the power and the duration we need to make renewables into very high penetration amounts, up into that 70, 80, 90% penetration. You have to have storage of this size and quantity. So there's no way we can get around this. And then they also talk about, well, if it's too difficult, they highlight a startup called QuidNet Energy, who actually does not use traditional reservoirs or ponds or what have you, and a lot of elevation change. Instead, they use a pressurized kind of underground facility to store energy and then release that to drive the turbine. So there's lots of flexibility. I love kind of hydro for storage. So, I thought this was great.
I think I like hydro as well. And I think there's a lot of hydro in the world, right? I just did an event a couple of weeks ago with the new CEO of Hydro-Quebec, Sophie Brochu. And I think, Canada considers or Quebec considers itself, kind of a battery, right? For potentially New York and for potentially the Northeast of the United States, right? Norway is the green battery for Europe, right? Because of Norway's hydro power, right? And as offshore wind in Denmark gets supported by, hydro from Norway. So this idea of the storage and hydro, I think, is a really interesting one. I guess my question was about, do we need new hydro, or can we use existing hydro to sort of do this? Or, how do we make it work with sort of existing hydro production versus having to sort of create new hydro sites or make alterations? That was kind of maybe a little bit, admittedly, maybe an ignorant question, but one that kind of, after reading the article, that's what I thought about.
Yeah, we'll definitely need more. Sadly, the utilization rate on hydro is pretty low. It's about the same as wind, but it's dispatchable. So that's key. So we'll definitely need more. So it will definitely have to grow quite a bit.
Yeah, my 2 cents. Actually, I kind of have a blanket statement for all of your articles, Lucas. So I won't give too much away on this one, but generally storage is going to be an all of the above solution. And one thing in particular I liked about this article is that we've talked about this or thought about it to the point where we had opportunity zones identified decades ago. And the gentleman here, Mr. Day, found this report and is using it. So imagine where we could have been if this was deployed, decades ago, how much further along we would have been. But it sounds like, Carolyn, to your question, it sounds like you can take existing infrastructure and just bolt on next to it. So you're not kind of reinventing the wheel from a capital standpoint. You're just augmenting what's out there, very smartly. So very good story. I liked it.
Yeah, I mean, you could take an existing like Hoover Dam, right? When they let the water out, it just runs down the river. So they could create a collection pond on the bottom, and then when there's too much, wind and solar, and we would curtail it, they could pump it back up into the reservoir.
Well, I think that's what this story talks.
I think that's what Carolyn wanted to get at, right?
Yeah, thank you. That was that really helped clarify one of my questions.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to move on. The next two I thought were really interesting because they are not lithium ion battery stories. The first one is EOS providing a zinc energy storage for California microgrids beginning in Q4. This is from Power Engineering on October 9th, which is a different technology. Again, I believe this is being driven by duration. So they want longer duration chemical energy storage. So this was interesting to see. And the other one was from Power Technology. That's power-technology.com. California Energy Commission picks vanadium instead of lithium batteries for major storage project. This is from October 7th. Again, these are long duration, non-lithium energy storage applications. So I just wanted to highlight that the utility kind of energy storage market is different than that of EVs, right? So EVs have some different requirements as far as, temperature and weight and rechargeability. So you're going to see rechargeability drive a lot of decisions for EV battery technology, whereas utilities might not have the same concerns, right? They're not trying to recharge everything in 30 minutes. They're okay with 3, 4, 5 hours of charging. And they're also looking at long duration. So what this means is that they want to run the battery for more and more hours, giving up power. And one of the solutions to that is what they call a flow battery. So in a normal battery, if it's contained, there's only so much electrolyte you can put in it. And flow batteries fix that. They don't have a single contained area for the electrolyte. They actually have 2 giant containers of electrolyte, and they flow it through the battery. So they have these giant anodes and cathodes, and then they can just flow tons and tons of electrolyte, so they can store tons of energy for the same power. And so this is right 4+ hours. This is going to be critical for high penetration of renewables. We need to store a lot of energy for a long time. And so this is a very, very good development. Eric?
Yeah, Carolyn, do you have volume, Carolyn?
Yeah, no, I thought the vanadium piece was fantastic. Like that to me, also did a brilliant job of sort of giving the difference, right? Kind of looking comparatively at lithium and vanadium. Am I pronouncing it correct? Would you say vanadium or vanadium?
I'd say vanadium. I don't know.
You'd say vanadium? Okay, so vanadium, you say potato, I say potato, right?
Right.
But I thought the way that they broke it down was for me was really interesting. So it was very informative. So if you're not like really informed about the sort of lithium versus vanadium, this was really helpful. And the idea of the tank, so the visual side of it versus the smaller cells that how they described lithium, and that it was safer and that it had more the duration side of it was better for storage. So I thought that was really interesting. And I think the fact that it's been sort of chosen over lithium batteries. And there's also some interesting right now conversations about and also around mining. that the article didn't go into depth about, but
Mhm.
did sort of reference the side of, you have to mine for lithium, whereas the vanadium can come from even oil and gas production, right? In terms of as a byproduct. So it doesn't necessarily require the same kind of intensive mining that that is, and it wasn't in this article, it was in the other article um, that was the one before
The
this.
zinc one. Yeah.
No, it wasn't in the zinc one. It was
No?
in the
Okay.
one before that. But it did a really nice breakdown, which kind of led me to say, oh, wow, we're looking at some different possibilities, right? I think most people associate batteries with lithium, and this
Right.
idea that you could have something other than lithium that could potentially be more secure, that might be easier and less exploitive, like less intensive in terms of the extractive process, and still be as as strong and still do the job. So that was my
Right.
take.
Yeah, to your point, we actually talked about a company in Canada that's doing lithium recycling. People don't recognize this. It was fascinating. When people are recycling lithium-ion batteries, most recyclers only recycle for the precious rare earth metals, and they burn away the excess lithium. So we're not even recycling lithium, and it's that precious to mine to begin with. Overall comment here, I thought this was a really good article, and then the next one you're going to have about storage. What I like is California is not just looking at this from a one-step solution right now. They're looking at all technologies right now. They're probably throwing a little bit out into the wind to see what comes back. But I do think that by testing these different types of technologies today, they'll be able to kind of come up with a more comprehensive grid plan for storage in the next decade or so that really looked at all these different materials for storage, and we'll get to a better solution as opposed to just putting lithium ion everywhere, putting zinc everywhere, putting vanadium everywhere. So California seems to be addressing it in a uncohesive, cohesive way, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to make the point that, right, each application has its own considerations and different technologies are going to be used for each. So I just thought it was great to see actual progress being made on this. So I wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, no, and I think both what you just said, Lucas, and what Eric said is such a great example of, right, the fact that there's so much happening right now. This is like a super exciting space, and there's a lot on the table, right? So it's going to be interesting to sort of go back to this conversation in 5 years and say, okay, was there one technology that won out, or is it a kind of a very much of an all of the above?
Right. That's a good point. It'll be interesting to see. We'll have you back on in 5 years. There you go.
I'll on my pirate shout out.
And you'll have your eye patch then too. So
that's when we'll be on right after 60 Minutes on CBS.
Yeah. My children will be old enough that they won't be like thinking about interrupting, disturbing their mom while she's on a call.
Okay, just one last quick article here. This is from teslarati.com. Tesla Powerwall 2 is completely dominating the US home storage energy storage market, according to a report. This is from Energy Sage. The article is by Simon Alvarez, posted on October 9th. Energy Sage is an online comparison shopping marketplace for rooftop solar and energy storage systems. If you haven't been there, you can go check that out. So they did some market research and they asked customers, what home storage solution are you looking at? And more than half of respondents picked Tesla first. And they believe that's because of this bar graph here. Tesla is the lowest price option compared to, Generac and Panasonic and LG Chem, Enphase and Salmon. So I just wanted to touch on this real quick. I thought it was really interesting. They do say that, off-grid is possible with Tesla's Powerwall 2. They have mobile app support. They have an integrated AC/DC converter, so installation is better. So even after installation, it's still the lowest cost. So I thought this was really interesting. The entire study is included, so you can click on the link we'll provide if you want to read all the details. So interesting to see.
Yeah, I thought it was great. I mean, I think Tesla has really done a pretty phenomenal job on its own marketing, right? And its own sort of pricing models, that they are able to be the lowest price in this space, but at the same time still sort of do kind of A to Z in terms of what the consumer wants if they're going to have home storage. And I think that makes a big difference. So it's kind of like easily plug in, so to say, that it's not a lot of, it makes it very easy for the consumer to adapt. I think that makes a big difference. A friend of mine, this is a little bit different, but a friend of mine had solar installed on her roof in June, and if you needed a marketer for Tesla, it was her. Like, they came as a team, they put up the panels, they set everything up, they came in their t-shirts. It was Tesla marketing at its best, right? But she and her husband were wildly impressed with just how professional they were and how well they did it. And I think that's what Tesla brings to this market. They bring a lot of professionalism, and they bring like really, I think, curated, aesthetically pleasing technology that that appeals to the consumer. And the idea that you can kind of have one company do it all is, I think, probably makes a difference and the price. So kind of like, you can say, well, we could just say, well, it's the lowest price, Lucas. Of course, it's the, dominating the US home energy storage market because it's the lowest price. But I don't think it's just that. Like, I think it's beyond just price.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would echo everything you guys just said. I think there is going to be a little difference. So I think when we looked at a couple stories about battery storage after the big Northeast power shutdown a couple months ago, and what I noticed was, for example, Nissan, they sell batteries for home storage in Europe and Asia, but they didn't come to the US market. And I think most players globally neglected the US market, thinking that we were just far behind on energy storage. Tesla did not. Tesla focused on the US, is now dominating that market. But I do think that LGs and others are going to catch up in the US and will be more competitive, which will be beneficial to the consumer in 5 years. Tesla is now like the Apple, right? They not only, well, they're cheaper than Apple on a relative basis, but the customer service and semantics of how they present themselves is very, very appealing. So hats off to them now. I want to see more competition coming out of this, and I think we're going to see it in a couple of years.
Well said.
Right.
Well said. Mm-hmm.
Well, we know you have to go feed your children.
The hungry giants beyond the door, right? Yes.
It's like the barbarians are attacking the pirates right now.
Barbarians are at the gate. In fact, they've broken down the gate, right? Go back to the pirate theme. It's a mutiny.
Love it. Well, listen, Carol, you've been a fantastic guest. Your energy and your comprehensive knowledge about energy markets is so appealing for us, and is going to be appealing for our listening audience. So it's great having you, and just thank you for everything.
It's such a pleasure. I love the fact that you choose such great articles that are, provocative and that just are discussion generating. So that's really fantastic. And you're doing a great service, I think, to your audience and to those that, will be your audience, because these are super important topics that we all sort of need to learn more about. So I appreciate the fact that you're making it accessible and fun at the same time. So really great to have been able to sit down with you both.
Did I not tell you that we had royalty on the show? We have royalty on the show.
Absolutely. I bow to the queen, the pirates bow. We do got to do our quick disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed by us are those of ourselves and not necessarily of the organizations we represent.
And as always, you can click follow on your favorite podcast site. We're on most podcast hosting sites, and we're also on YouTube. If you want to see our beautiful faces, you can click subscribe there, and you got to click that little alarm bell, and then you get the notification on your phone like I do. So,
and I promise we're going to have episode 4 of our car reviews once I finish reviewing Lucas's 47 segments that he sends to me that I put on video of his Chevy Bolt. But we will have that up and running in a couple of days as well. So
no screeching tires though. I'm kind of disappointed in myself.
Well, just have to do that for the next review.
Maybe next time.
Anyways, Carolyn, thank you very much.
Eric and Lucas, thanks again for having me. Really appreciate it. It was a pleasure, a lot of fun. So both of you take care, and everyone out there stay safe and stay well.
Thank you. And once again, I'm Eric Planey.
I'm Lucas Finko.
And together with Carolyn, we are the Pirates of Clean Tech. Arr.
Adios.
Bye.